Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The grinder of Fort Adams Academy shimmered under the morning sun, that cold metallic light that made every scuff of a boot and every breath of discipline feel like iron in the air. Rows of cadets stood in formation, straight backs, rehearsed faces, egos polished as bright as their nameplates. They were the future of the Navy, or so they told themselves. Then she appeared. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres. No dress blues, no rows of ribbons, just a plain gray sweatshirt, black fatigues, and eyes that had seen too much to need decoration. She moved through the morning like quiet gravity, the kind that pulls without sound, without effort. But the cadets didn't see gravity. They saw someone ordinary. From the back, a voice whispered, "She looks like logistics." Another muttered, "More like someone's mom got lost on base." A ripple of laughter spread like a crack in the formation. No one stopped it. Why would they? To them, she wasn't someone to fear. She wasn't the war they were preparing for. She was a question mark in a gray sweatshirt. Rachel didn't flinch. She'd heard worse from men who meant it, not boys still learning to salute. She stepped forward, her tone even, carrying more weight than rank alone could grant. 10 laps full gear, now. The laughter cut out as if someone had snapped a wire. Helmets shifted. Boots shuffled. Colonel Hayes, watching from the observation deck, didn't say a word. He just folded his arms, expression unreadable. The cadets hesitated. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. The silence itself did the shouting. By the time the first pair of boots struck dirt, the morning had turned into rhythm, the syncopated drum of leather, gravel, and breath. Rachel stood at the field's edge, clipboard tucked under her arm, the sunlight catching a faint scar beneath her collarbone. Small, precise, but it told a story no one had earned the right to hear yet. At 34, she moved with that strange contradiction, youth in her face, age in her stillness. She didn't waste words, didn't fill silence with noise. She simply existed like a held breath, patient, calculating, present. "All right, listen up," Colonel Hayes barked from the catwalk. "This is your new PT instructor. Lieutenant Commander Torres will be running training for the next 6 weeks. You'll give her the same respect you give every officer." A pause, then, as if on cue, a murmur from the back. Cadet Eric Vaughn, tall, broad-shouldered, confidence bordering on caricature. He smirked. "She looks more like a fitness blogger than a SEAL instructor." Nolan Briggs, his shadow and echo, added, "Probably some desk transfer. Got that PowerPoint professional vibe." Rachel heard them both. She always did. Years in the field had taught her how to pick out a whisper through rotor wash and rifle fire. But she said nothing. She learned the long way that the loudest voices rarely had stories worth listening to. "We'll start simple," she said. Her tone was measured, calm, but there was a current beneath it like distant thunder. 2-mile warm-up, then gear drills. Vaughn crossed his arms. 2 miles, that's it. You can add distance if you're feeling brave, cadet. That earned a few cautious chuckles, laughter that couldn't decide if it was safe. They broke formation and began their run. Rachel jogged beside them. No whistle, no barking orders, just the steady cadence of her boots matching theirs, every step identical, measured, precise. By the first mile, chatter faded into the raw sound of breath. Sweat replaced arrogance. Vaughn pushed harder, unwilling to be outpaced by someone who looked, to him, like a civilian in uniform. Rachel didn't even look winded. By mile 2, he glanced sideways. She wasn't breathing heavy. Her stride didn't change. Her eyes were ahead, unbothered, focused. "Ma'am," he gasped between breaths, "you said 2 miles. "I did," she answered evenly. "That was before you started complaining. Now it's 4. The groans came low, resigned. None dared protest again. When they finally returned to the field, half the cadets collapsed to their knees, gasping. Rachel stopped exactly on the line, not a step short, not one extra. She turned back toward them. "Recover," she said simply. Her breathing hadn't changed. The scar on her collarbone glistened faintly in the sun. Colonel Hayes watched her from above, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He'd seen this method before, the quiet kind. The kind that taught through presence, not power. Vaughn wiped sweat from his brow, glaring up. "You trying to prove something, ma'am?" Rachel met his eyes, calm, measured. "Nothing to prove, cadet," she said. "I already learned what you're still chasing." That line hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke. "Discipline," she said softly, "is learned, not claimed." And just like that, she turned and walked off the field. No dramatics, no victory. Just a woman whose silence demanded attention. No one laughed this time. The next morning, rain came like judgment. A thin drizzle at first, then a steady curtain that turned the parade ground into something darker, heavier. Mud seeped under boots. The smell of wet steel hung in the air. Rachel stood at the edge of the grinder again, clipboard under her arm, rain tapping softly against her sleeve. The cadets gathered slower today. Their bravado had thinned, though arrogance still lingered, faint but alive. "Morning, ma'am," Vaughn called, voice dripping with the kind of humor that tries to hide insecurity. "Heard we're running laps again. You sure your knees can handle another day?" Nolan Briggs chuckled behind him. "Yeah, she probably stretches to yoga podcasts." More laughter, tight, uncertain. Rachel glanced at her watch. Then calmly, "Since you're all awake enough to joke, make it 5 miles, full kit." The laughter died on contact. "Ma'am, it's raining," Vaughn started. "Then it's good training weather." She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. They ran. Rain turned to sheets, wind tugging at straps and hoods. Mud thickened underfoot, sucking at boots. Within minutes, every cadet was drenched, except she didn't seem to notice. Rachel ran beside them again. Same pace, same silence, same stillness beneath motion. By mile 3, Vaughn's breath rasped like gravel. His grin was gone. "She's not even human," Briggs muttered. "She's bluffing," Vaughn panted, "trying to prove a point." Rachel heard every word. She didn't react. She just pushed the pace by half a step. The sound of rain swallowed everything else, the rhythm of effort, the grit of failure. When they finished, the field was a river of brown water. "Drop packs," Rachel ordered. "Form up, we're not done." Groans rolled through the group. Push-ups, rope climbs, crawls. Mud-splattered faces and eyes, sweat mixed with rain. Vaughn cursed under his breath. "This is insane." Rachel crouched beside him mid-climb, her voice calm, close, cold. "No, cadet, this is discipline, the difference between quitting and surviving." He glared at her. "This isn't combat." Her eyes flickered, not anger, just memory. "You're right. Combat doesn't stop when you want it to." She stood, blew the whistle once. The sound cut through the rain like a blade. "On your bellies," she called. "Low crawl, 60 yards, no breaks." Someone shouted, 60. She didn't answer. She dropped to the mud herself, clean, fast, elbows slicing through sludge with the precision of someone who'd done it before. Not in training, but in war. The cadets hesitated, then followed. By the second yard, helmets scraped wire. Mud-filled sleeves. Vaughn's elbow slipped, slamming into the ground. "This is a joke," he snapped. "We're not grunts." Rachel paused mid-crawl, turned her head just enough for her voice to carry. "Then prove it," she said quietly. "I'm done." She rose slowly, mud streaking her arm like paint. "Then explain to Colonel Hayes why your unit failed under your lead." That silenced him faster than any shout could. He stepped closer, jaw clenched, eyes hot with defiance. "You think you can just." "Careful, cadet." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried something colder than rank, something field-born, something that lived in silence and gunfire. Vaughn froze. Behind them, whispers returned, but they'd changed shape. No longer mockery, unease. The rain intensified. and somewhere behind the curtain of water, thunder cracked like distant artillery. Rachel's hand brushed the trident-etched wristband she wore. The leather, worn smooth by years of use, caught against her pulse. She didn't look at it. Didn't need to. The memory was alive enough without it. Helmand Province. The smell of diesel and blood. Her team pinned down, Harper's voice in her ear. Tors, move, you're exposed. Her elbow hitting sand. A crawl through chaos. A man bleeding out 2 meters ahead. A promise made. Thunder snapped her back to the present. Up, she shouted, run it again. The cadets groaned, disbelief turning into despair. You don't rise when it's easy, she called, her voice cutting clean through the storm. You rise when it hurts. By the end of the hour, every face was streaked with exhaustion and mud. The laughter was gone. All that remained was effort, raw and real. Vaughn collapsed to his knees, panting, eyes burning. You can't keep doing this, he spat. You're gonna break us. Rachel tilted her head slightly, water dripping from her chin. No, cadet, she said softly. I'm showing you what it takes not to break. He scoffed bitterly. You talk like you've seen war. Rachel didn't answer. She just blew the whistle again. Form up. The sound of rain filled the silence she left behind. And in that moment, as mud clung to boots, as pain turned to realization, even Vaughn didn't know that the woman he'd mocked was the kind who didn't just talk about surviving battles. She'd already done it. More than once. And tomorrow, the lesson would only get harder. Why was she still running with them? The rain had turned from steady to merciless, each drop hitting the ground like small detonations against the mud. Most instructors would have called it off by now. Most officers would have sought cover, justified it as unsafe training conditions. But Lieutenant Commander Rachel Tors wasn't most officers. Her boots carved trenches into the soaked ground, every motion deliberate, every breath steady. Around her, cadets stumbled, slipped, cursed, packs clattered, voices cracked, but she didn't slow down. She ran with them, shoulder to shoulder, as if to remind them that leadership didn't live on a podium. It lived in the mud. The sky flashed white, thunder followed. Colonel Hayes watched from the catwalk, arms folded, rain dripping off the brim of his cap. His lips pressed together in a faint smile that was half admiration, half memory. He'd served long enough to know what kind of people could command silence without yelling. Tors was one of them. Drop packs, she said. The words were calm but cut through the storm like a blade. The cadets obeyed, half from exhaustion, half from something else, something they couldn't name yet but could feel in their bones. Rachel walked past the line. Her uniform clung to her skin, soaked through. The gray of her sweatshirt darkened to near black. Mud streaked her forearms, like the war paint of someone who'd stopped caring what others thought long ago. Her steps left deep, even prints, proof of someone who'd carried heavier weight before. Push-ups, she said, 50, then low crawl. Groans rolled across the field, but no one dared speak up. Except Vaughn. He wasn't used to silence. He wasn't used to losing. This is pointless, he muttered, his arms trembling. We're not infantry, we're officers, leaders. Rachel stopped mid-step. She turned, rain dripping from her jawline, and looked straight at him. Then lead, she said softly. The simplicity of it landed harder than any shout could. Vaughn looked down, face tight with defiance, then pushed through the next rep until his arms nearly gave out. Rachel crouched nearby, elbows resting on her knees, voice calm enough to cut through noise. Discipline isn't a rank. It's what you do when no one's watching. She stood again and blew the whistle once. The sound cracked through the storm. On your bellies, she said. Low crawl, 60 yards, stay low or the wire teaches you. Mud splashed as helmets hit the ground. The cadets dropped, some too slow, some too eager. Rachel went aground with them, elbows tight, hips low, every motion deliberate. She moved like someone born in the dirt. Halfway down the lane, Vaughn drifted closer. Maybe it was ego, maybe it was frustration, maybe both. He accidentally brushed against her shoulder enough to knock her off balance. Her chest hit the mud hard. Cold water rushed under her collar. And someone laughed. "Oops," Vaughn said, trying to sound playful. "My bad, ma'am." The formation fractured, a ripple of nervous chuckles. Someone whistled. Another muttered, "Guess she can bleed after all." Even Briggs let out a quick laugh, short, ugly, born from relief more than humor. Rachel didn't move. For a second she just breathed, palms pressed into the ground. Then slowly she rose. Forearms, core, knees, one smooth, unbroken motion. The mud clung to her sleeves like memory. Rain slid off her face in quiet sheets. She didn't brush it away. She just looked at Vaughn. No rage, no words, just a silence that made him wish she'd shouted instead. "Cadet Vaughn," she said, voice steady, front and center. Every head turned. The laughter died instantly. Vaughn hesitated. "Ma'am." "Now." He stood, mud running down his arms, pride faltering but not gone. He walked forward until he was close enough to see the faint grit in her eyelashes. "You think this is a joke?" she asked quietly. He swallowed. "No, ma'am." "Good." She nodded once. "Lead the next crawl." A flicker of disbelief passed through the ranks. She dropped to the mud again. "Show them how it's done." For a moment Vaughn hesitated. Then, under the weight of 50 pairs of eyes, he went prone. The wire above him shimmered with rain. He started crawling. His movement was loud, sloppy elbows, wide knees, splashes too heavy. It was strength without control, noise without rhythm. "Stop," Rachel said. She slid beside him, smooth as breath. "Watch." And she moved. It wasn't a demonstration, it was an education. Her body became a metronome of discipline. Every elbow planted, every knee angled, every motion a quiet conversation between gravity and purpose. Rain hammered her back. Mud streaked her arms in perfect symmetry. "Do you feel that?" she said, voice low. "The wire hums when you're sloppy. You can't hear it because you're too loud." Vaughn's chest heaved. "What's the difference?" She looked at him, loud as panic pretending to be speed, fast as quiet. Her words lingered longer than they should have. She reached the end of the lane, rose fluidly, and turned back toward them. "Again," she said, "Vaughn leads, everyone watches." He didn't argue. He went back to the start, his pride cracked open but not broken. This time he crawled differently, still clumsy, still slow but trying. Rachel followed at his flank, silent, observant. "Anchor," she murmured. "Don't slap, place, pull, exhale on release, inhale on anchor." He copied her rhythm. The formation followed. And then something unexpected happened. The laughter that had once filled the field was replaced by rhythm. A quiet cadence of effort and learning. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Colonel Hayes watched from the tower. His fingers drummed once on the railing. "She's not teaching them to crawl," he said under his breath. "She's teaching them to survive." Down below, Rachel stood again, mud dripping from her sleeves, rain streaking across her face. "This isn't punishment," she said. "It's instruction. If you treat it like punishment, you'll learn the wrong lesson." A long silence followed. Something shifted in the air, not victory, not defeat, understanding. Vaughn's gaze dropped to his arms. The mud there matched the bands on hers, the same color, the same shape. He had thought he'd marked her, but he hadn't. He'd only marked himself. The next crawl was faster, quieter. By the end of the day, the field wasn't filled with arrogance anymore. It was filled with movement that meant something. Rachel stood at the far edge of the training lane as the rain began to fade into mist. She could feel the ache building in her shoulders, old pain, the kind that never quite healed. And as she exhaled, a memory rose unbidden. Helmand Province, 2014. The world on fire. Sandstorm wind slicing through gunfire. A man's voice over comms, "Tors, you're exposed, move." Her elbow had slipped then too, not from a cadet's shove but a blast wave. Her teammate Harper had been pinned down 20 meters ahead, bleeding out behind a half-collapsed wall. She could still taste the sand, still feel the weight of him in her arms. The crawl wasn't training, it never had been, it was memory. And she was making sure none of them forgot what the mud could take from you if you didn't respect it. By the time the storm ended, Fort Adams was half drowned. Lights flickered in the barracks. Water ran off the rooftops in thin silver streams. Most of the cadets had passed out before their boots were dry. But Rachel sat alone in her office. A single desk lamp buzzed overhead. The shadows around her seemed alive, like ghosts of people she used to know. She opened a small metal box. Inside, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, lay two things: a dull gold seal trident patch and a photo. 4 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in a desert that looked more like another planet. Her thumb brushed across the face of one man, Chief Warrant Officer Dean Harper. He was grinning, sunburned, fearless, and alive in a way that people who hadn't seen war could never understand. Her breath hitched. Outside, rain started again, soft and rhythmic, like the memory of gunfire turned merciful. In her mind, she was back there, the roar of the explosion, the burning sand, the taste of dust and iron. "You get them home, Tors," Harper had said, voice broken, fatting. She tried to lift him. He'd coughed once, blood streaking his lips, and smiled. Then he was gone. Rachel stared at the photo, her hand trembling just slightly. "You failed him once," her thoughts whispered, "but you're still carrying them home, one cadet at a time." The rain outside softened, like a heartbeat finding rest. Rachel closed the box gently, pressed her palm flat on the lid, and whispered, "Still keeping my promise." The words were barely sound, more exhale than voice. But they filled the room with something weightier than grief. She looked at her reflection in the window, the faint scar beneath her collarbone, the trident's imprint on her wristband barely visible beneath the leather. Tomorrow would bring another day of doubt, another test, another chance to rebuild the ones who didn't yet understand what real strength looked like. The base lights flickered once. Outside, the wind shifted. And in that quiet hour between storms, Rachel Tors, the woman they thought was just another instructor, became something else entirely. A keeper of promises. A silent architect of resilience. The kind of soldier who never stopped crawling forward, even when the world tried to bury her. Why was the auditorium packed at dawn? No one had expected a briefing. There wasn't one on the schedule, no orders, no memo, just a single line on the board outside the mess hall. All cadets report to the main auditorium, full attendance. By the time Eric Vaughn arrived, the air inside felt strange. Not tense, not casual, just heavy, like something was about to change and no one yet knew how. Rows of uniforms filled the seats. The sound of boots scraping, whispers, restrained yawns, the kind of noise that lives between nerves and boredom. Rachel Tors sat off to the side near the stage. Her uniform was crisp, no mud, no rain, just clean lines and quiet composure. She didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't make small talk. She sat like someone who'd learned long ago that silence was stronger than words. Beside her, Colonel Hayes flipped through a folder thick with sealed documents. His eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on Vaughn in the second row. The colonel's expression didn't reveal much, but it didn't have to. Vaughn suddenly felt smaller than he wanted to admit. He leaned toward Nolan Briggs. "Probably another lecture about teamwork," he muttered. Briggs smirked. "Guess she's got a fan club now, even the colonel's escorting her." Eric's grin faltered when Hayes stepped to the podium. The colonel wasn't smiling. Cadets, he began, voice calm but sharp enough to slice through the low chatter. This morning's briefing will be different. The whispers died instantly. You've met your new physical instructor, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres, Hayes continued. Some of you may think you already know her, but assumptions in the field, he said, tapping the folder lightly, can get people killed. He pressed a button on the remote in his hand. The lights dimmed. A single slide appeared on the massive screen behind him, the emblem of Naval Special Warfare Command. Beneath it, SEAL Team 2, Operation Sentinel Dawn. Lieutenant Commander Rachel M. Torres. Silver Star, Valor in Combat. The silence that followed wasn't respectful, it was stunned. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the sound of a collective gasp, soft, sharp, almost synchronized. Eric's chest tightened. Colonel Hayes went on, his voice low, deliberate. Lieutenant Commander Torres served 12 years in naval special operations, multiple deployments, classified missions. She led rescue operations under live fire and carried her own wounded through enemy territory. He clicked again. The next slide appeared, a photograph. Rachel in desert fatigues, rifle at low ready, dust and light in her hair. Behind her, a convoy half buried in smoke. Another click, her kneeling beside an injured soldier, one hand pressed over a bleeding wound, eyes focused on something just beyond the frame. Eric recognized that look, calm under chaos, the same expression she'd worn in the rain when he'd mocked her. Hayes's tone softened slightly, but his words didn't lose their edge. Some of you know the name Operation Sentinel Dawn. Most don't. It was one of the deadliest engagements of the Helmand campaign. When their convoy was ambushed and most of the unit fell, Lieutenant Commander Torres held the perimeter until extraction, alone. No one spoke. The screen froze on a final image, Rachel mud-smeared, eyes blazing through a sandstorm, her hand gripping a radio, jaw set with that quiet, immovable focus. Then Hayes lowered the remote and turned toward her. Commander Torres, he said, voice softer now, the floor is yours. Rachel stood slowly. No theatrics, no introduction beyond her rank. Her boots hit the stage softly, one step then another. When she reached the microphone, she didn't speak right away. She let the silence breathe. I know most of you didn't believe in me yesterday, she began. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You laughed. You doubted. Some of you thought I was just another instructor. Her gaze swept across the room, not accusatory, just observant, seeing, not judging. I don't blame you, she continued. Ignorance is part of training, we all start there. She paused, the kind of pause that gives every word weight. But respect, she said quietly, isn't given, it's earned. She turned slightly, looking toward the screen as another image flickered behind her. Not a photo this time, but video. Helmet cam footage. The horizon blurred with sand, voices shouting, orders cutting through static. Then her voice, calm, clear, move to the truck, I've got Overwatch, go. Gunfire, dust, a flash. The screen filled with smoke. Through it, a silhouette dragging a wounded man toward cover. Then the image froze again, her face, half covered in grit, eyes steady, mouth set. Back in the room, you could have heard a pin drop. Someone whispered, that's her. Another, my God. Rachel turned back to the cadets. Every one of you, she said, will face something that tests you. It won't always look like combat. Sometimes it's failure. Sometimes it's humiliation. Sometimes it's fear. Her tone deepened, weighted by something unseen. You thought yesterday was about fitness, she said softly. It was. It was about how you react when the ground takes you down, because it will. It always does. Her eyes found Vaughn for just a fraction of a second. She didn't need to say his name. He looked away, jaw tight, throat heavy. I've seen men mock what they don't understand, she continued. I've seen arrogance break faster than bone, and I've learned that strength doesn't shout. Her eyes scanned the room, calm and piercing all at once. It doesn't need to. Strength is quiet, it's deliberate, it endures. The next slide appeared behind her. A team photo. 7 soldiers, sunburned, dirty, smiling. Rachel in the center, her expression caught between exhaustion and pride. To her left, Chief Warrant Officer Dean Harper, his arms slung over her shoulder, grin bright even through the dust. Rachel's breath faltered, barely noticeable, but it was there. "This," she said softly, gesturing toward the screen, "was my family." She looked down briefly, then back up. "We didn't wear rank out there. We didn't care who ran the laps faster or who barked the loudest orders. We cared about who got up when they were hit, who finished what they started, who carried the others home." Her voice broke slightly, just once enough to sound human. "You have that same choice," she said, "every single day you're here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of guilt, of respect. Vaughn sat rigid in his chair. Every insult, every smirk, every word he'd thrown at her replayed like echoes in his head. His throat tightened. She turned away from the podium, her voice lower now, almost intimate. "You wanted to see leadership," she asked quietly. "That's what it looks like. Not medals, not authority, just the willingness to keep going when no one's left to watch." Colonel Hayes stepped forward again, voice carrying softly. "Lieutenant Commander Torres is living proof that courage and discipline aren't theories. They're choices. Remember that before you measure anyone by appearance again." No one moved. Then slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant, unsure. Then another joined. Then another. Until the entire auditorium filled with the sound, not the sharp clapping of ceremony, but the deep, rhythmic applause of realization. Rachel didn't smile, she didn't bow, she didn't need to. She simply nodded once, her expression composed, the faintest flicker of emotion crossing her eyes before it vanished again. When the applause faded, she said just one thing. "The mud teaches faster than words ever could." Then she stepped down from the stage, walking past rows of cadets who couldn't meet her eyes, not out of shame, but out of reverence. Vaughn sat frozen. He didn't speak, didn't blink. His fingers curled tight against his knees, as if to hold onto something solid in a moment that had completely unmade him. Outside, the storm had broken. The sky was a pale wash of gray and gold. The rain had stopped, but the ground still glistened like glass. Rachel walked across the empty field alone. Her boots sank into the soft earth, every step pulling at memory. She could still hear Harper's voice in her mind. "You get them home." A promise, a burden, a mission that never really ended. She stopped at the far edge of the grinder, the same place she'd stood that first morning when they laughed at her. The wind caught the corner of her sleeve, lifting it just enough to reveal the faint imprint of the trident pressed into her wristband. It glinted once in the new sunlight. Not decoration, not pride, just proof. Proof that she'd lived through what they could only train for. Proof that dignity doesn't shout, it endures. Colonel Hayes watched her from the balcony above the field. "She rebuilt them," he murmured to himself, "and they don't even know it yet." Rachel didn't turn, she didn't need to. Because for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, not for her rank but for her silence. And that, she thought, was enough. The storm had passed, but the lesson, the one written in mud, in rain, in patience, was just beginning to take root. Why did the air feel so heavy that morning? The storm had left Fort Adams quiet, too quiet. The parade ground shimmered under the pale dawn light, wet earth steaming where sunlight met lingering rain. Every boot print left from yesterday's drills had hardened overnight, fossils of pain, effort, and pride. The cadets stood in formation, quieter than anyone could remember. No laughter, no smirks, just breathing. Heavy, unified, real. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres faced them from the front. Her fatigues were clean again, but the mud stains along her boots hadn't washed out. She hadn't tried to remove them. Some dirt, she believed, was earned. Her eyes moved across the formation, each cadet, each pair of tired shoulders. They looked different now. Less like individuals, more like a unit. But she knew how fragile that illusion could be. Pride had a way of creeping back in once comfort returned. "This is your final evaluation," she said. Her voice carried easily across the damp air. "It's not about time, it's about endurance, it's about each other." She paused, letting the words land like weight on every chest. No one finishes alone. No one is left behind. You move together or you fail together. From the observation tower, Colonel Hayes folded his arms, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Let's see if they've learned anything," he murmured. Rachel raised the whistle to her lips. The sharp tweet cut through the air like a rifle crack. "Go!" The formation surged forward. Mud splashed, boots pounded, shouts filled the open air. The first obstacle, a massive rope net, slick with last night's rain. Cadet Nolan Briggs slipped halfway up, boots skidding on the wet rope. He cursed under his breath. Before he could fall, Eric Vaughn reached down instinctively and caught the strap of his pack. "Move, Briggs," Eric shouted, voice raw but firm. "You're not stopping now." Briggs gritted his teeth, hauled himself up and climbed again, Vaughn's hand steadying him from above. Rachel's voice cut through the noise. "Good, that's what a team sounds like." The pair went over the top and dropped hard into the mud on the other side, rolling once before getting up again. Ahead lay the balance beams slick, half submerged in brown water. Cadets wobbled, flailed, fell. But every time one stumbled, another reached out to steady them. Rachel walked alongside, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the mud, her eyes scanning every movement like a field commander reading a battlefield. "Center your weight," she called. "Hips slow, eyes forward, watch your partner's rhythm." Her tone was sharp but never cruel. Every word was a correction, never a criticism. And every cadet obeyed, not because they feared her, but because they believed her. Vaughn moved steadily now. He didn't bark jokes, he didn't show off, he just breathed, balanced, focused. By the halfway mark, his lungs were on fire. His legs felt like lead. But somewhere in that exhaustion, a strange calm lived. The noise in his head, the arrogance, the doubt was gone. All that remained was the next step. Half an hour in, they reached the 12-foot wall. Rainwater dripped from the slick boards. A single rope hung dead center. "Pair up," Rachel shouted. "If you can't climb it, pull someone who can't. Nobody stays down." The cadets moved in twos. Mills, the smallest of the group, jumped, missed, hit the wall and slid down again, mud streaking his uniform. He tried again, and again failed. Eric saw it. "Mills, come on," he shouted. "I've got you." He crouched low, locking his hands together as a foothold. Mills planted his boot, pushed, and Vaughn lifted hard. Mills caught the rope, hauled himself up, muscles trembling. At the top, he turned back, panting, and offered his hand down. Eric gripped it, and together they climbed over. When their boots hit the ground, Rachel was watching. For a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of approval, quiet but real. The next obstacle was the crawl trench. Low wire, deep mud, the same one that had broken their pride days earlier. But this time, no one joked. No one hesitated. Rachel dropped to the ground first, elbows tight, eyes level. "Stay low," she called. "Control the panic. Mud's just earth and water, you've faced worse." Her voice wasn't command, it was guidance. Vaughn followed, face streaked with dirt, breathing hard but steady. The wire above his helmet hummed faintly. Every inch forward was earned. Halfway through, his arm buckled. Pain shot through his shoulder, the kind that locks the whole body for an instant. He fell flat, mud splattering his face. Rachel was beside him instantly, one knee sinking into the muck. "Talk to me," she said, voice calm. "Shoulder," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Cramps." "Then listen to me," she said, eyes steady. "If you fall, you fail your team. Get up." "I can't." "Yes, you can," she interrupted. "You've been saying you can't since the day I met you. You're out of excuses, cadet." He stared at her, mud-streaked, jaw shaking, pride bleeding into pain. Then something inside him shifted. He planted his elbow, pulled, crawled. 1 inch, then another, then another. Rachel moved with him, shouting above the wind, her voice rising not in anger but in strength. "That's how you lead from the ground." The others heard it, they matched his pace. Until the trench wasn't chaos anymore, it was rhythm, unified motion, effort turned into choreography. By the time they reached the end, every cadet was coated in mud from helmet to boot, but not one had stopped. Rachel stood, rain dripping from her cap brim. She looked down the line, a formation of exhaustion, unity, and transformation. They'd finally learned. And it showed. The final test came at the sandbag carry. 50 meters. 50 pounds each. Through mud that swallowed your boots and refused to let go. "Carry your partner's weight like your own," Rachel shouted. "Move." They lifted together, stumbled, grunted, moved anyway. Nolan tripped halfway through. His bag hit the ground. He dropped to one knee. Eric didn't even think. He swung part of his own load over Nolan's shoulder and shouted, "Don't quit. We finish this together." Rachel slowed behind them, her voice dropping low, almost to herself. "That's it," she murmured. "That's what it's supposed to look like." The formation pushed forward, a blur of mud, breath, and raw human grit. Every step was agony. Every breath a battle. But no one stopped. Not one. When they crossed the finish line, they collapsed in one tangled heap, mud-covered, trembling, breathing like engines pushed to the brink. Rachel blew the whistle once, sharp, final. "Recover." No one spoke. Only the sound of rainwater dripping off helmets, of lungs dragging in air, of silence earned the hard way. Colonel Hayes lowered his binoculars. "She rebuilt them," he said quietly to another instructor, "from the inside out." Rachel turned to her cadets. "You passed," she said softly. A few heads lifted, eyes wide with disbelief. "Not because you're strong," she continued, "but because you learned what strength actually is." Her voice dropped low and steady, every word sinking deep. "The mud isn't punishment, it's the classroom." Eric straightened, chest still heaving. For the first time, he didn't look at her as an opponent. He looked at her as a leader, one he'd finally earned the right to learn from. He swallowed once. "Thank you, ma'am." Rachel gave a single nod. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just remember." Behind her, the clouds began to break. Thin light slipped through, painting the field in gold. The mud steamed under it, warm now, forgiving. The same ground that had broken them had also rebuilt them. Later, when the field was quiet again, Rachel lingered. The cadets had gone. The air smelled of salt from the nearby coast. Colonel Hayes approached slowly, boots squelching against the soft earth. "Well done, Commander," he said, voice low. Rachel didn't look up. She was watching the drying footprints, dozens of them, scattered and deep. "They did it themselves," she said. "I just made sure they saw how." The colonel smiled faintly. "You know, I used to think toughness was about who could shout the loudest. Then I met people like you." She allowed herself the smallest smile. "Shouting's easy, sir. Listening's harder." He chuckled once, then looked out at the field. "You ever think you'll stop teaching?" Rachel's gaze followed his. The field was calm now, the air soft. "No," she said finally. "I made a promise a long time ago. I intend to keep it." The colonel nodded. "Then I'll get out of your way." He walked off, leaving her standing alone, quiet still, a silhouette against the light. She looked down at her wrist. The leather band was damp, darker than usual. The trident imprint beneath it pressed faintly against her skin. A memory flickered, Harper's grin, his voice over comms, that final promise. "Get them home, Tors." She whispered back, "I'm still trying." The words faded into the wind. The field was empty again. But in that emptiness lived something rare, the quiet after a lesson that had changed more than minds. It had changed hearts. And for Rachel Tors, that was the only kind of victory that ever mattered. Why was she still awake long after the base lights went out? The barracks were silent, that heavy kind of silence that only comes after exhaustion. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the window panes. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut, and then nothing. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Tors sat alone at her desk, the soft glow of a single lamp cutting a small island of light into the darkness. Her hair was still damp from the evening's rain, tied back loosely now, fatigue softening the edges of her posture. In front of her sat a small, scratched metal lockbox. It looked ordinary, the kind of box you mistake for storage, but Rachel had carried it from base to base for over a decade. The key hung from a simple chain around her neck, pressed close to her skin, close to her pulse. She turned it now between her fingers, before sliding it into the lock. Click! The lid lifted. Inside, wrapped in a folded handkerchief, lay two things: a faded seal trident patch, its gold worn to bronze, and a photograph. She unfolded it gently. 4 soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder in a desert of dust and ruin. Their smiles wide, sunburned, exhausted but alive. Her thumb brushed over one face, Chief Warrant Officer Dean Harper. He had that grin, the kind that could disarm fear itself. Broad, reckless, the grin of a man who had laughed in the face of every storm life had thrown at him. Rachel exhaled slowly. The air felt heavy with ghosts. She leaned back in her chair, the photograph trembling slightly in her hand. The hum of the fluorescent light above her seemed to fade into the distance until all she could hear was wind, hot, dry wind. And just like that, she was no longer in her office. She was back in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The world was sand and fire. The sun had been a white blur overhead, the kind that boiled sweat before it could fall. The convoy had stopped at what was supposed to be a safe compound, stone walls pitted with age, a roof half gone. Rachel crouched behind the front truck, radio pressed to her ear. "Eagle 2, we're at checkpoint," she said, scanning the horizon through the shimmer of heat. "Visibility's bad, requesting confirmation of route." Static, then Harper's voice, rough, calm, carrying that unshakable steadiness she'd come to rely on. "Route confirmed, Tors. You've got 30 minutes before the next dust storm rolls in. Let's move quick." She gave the signal. The team fanned out, 6 men, 1 woman, SEAL Team 2. Each one a professional, seasoned, efficient. Then came the sound, faint at first, like pebbles skipping across tin. Tab, tab, tab. "Incoming rounds." "Contact front," someone shouted. The air exploded. The first rocket hit the far truck, a flash, then thunder. The world turned orange. Dust, smoke, heat, everything folding together in chaos. Rachel's radio crackled. "Ambush, south wall, move, move." She sprinted low, rifle up, heart hammering in rhythm with the gunfire. She dove behind the crumbling stone wall, the edge biting into her shoulder. "Harper," she shouted over the noise, "they're flanking." "Hold position," his voice roared back through comms. "I'll get the wounded, cover the east." She peeked around the wall, saw Harper 20 meters ahead, dragging a man whose vest was slick with blood. "Don't," her mind screamed, "don't go out there." But she moved anyway. Rachel had always been the one who moved. Bullets tore the sand around her feet, the shockwaves vibrating up through her boots. She slid down beside Harper, helping him pull the wounded man behind a half-destroyed truck. He grinned through the dust. "You ever listen to orders?" She shot him a look, half glare, half relief. "You ever give good ones?" He barked a laugh, that same careless laugh that somehow made hell feel human again. Then another explosion hit. The world tipped. Heat, light, a sound so loud it erased everything. When Rachel opened her eyes, she was on her back, ears ringing. The air was thick with dust and blood and static. "Harper," she shouted. No answer. "Harper." She pushed up, vision swimming, and saw him, pinned under debris, barely conscious, one arm trapped, his rifle lying just out of reach. She ran, boots sliding, lungs burning. She clawed through debris until she reached him. His eyes met hers. He smiled, that infuriating, impossible grin. "You're supposed to be in cover," he rasped. "You're supposed to be alive," she shot back, kneeling beside him. She braced her shoulder against the wreckage, tried to lift. It didn't budge. "Come on," she muttered, teeth gritted. "Move." "Tours," he said quietly. She stopped, looked down. Blood soaked his shirt, spreading fast. He coughed once, his hand tightening weakly on hers. "You get them home," he whispered. "Don't," she said, shaking her head. "Don't you start that, we're both getting out." He smiled again, softer this time. "That's an order, Lieutenant." The sound that came next wasn't an explosion. It was the silence that follows one. She held his hand until it went still. Then the world fell away. Smoke, fire, the sound of shouting miles away, but somehow still inside her head. She didn't remember moving, only crawling, dragging herself through rubble, pulling the wounded by their vests, hearing her name shouted through static until her throat went raw. When the rescue chopper came hours later, she wasn't sure if she was alive or just too stubborn to stop pretending. All she knew was that she'd left a part of herself under that wall with Harper, and that some promises never stop echoing. The hum of the fluorescent light came back. Rachel blinked. She was sitting at her desk again, the desert gone, the photograph still in her hands. She placed it carefully beside the trident patch. Her hand shook slightly, not from weakness, but from memory trying to live again. The rain outside had started once more, light, steady. The rhythm matched her pulse. She stared at the photo until the faces blurred, then focused again. "You failed him once," the voice in her head whispered, "but you're still carrying them home, one cadet at a time." She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, exhaled slower. That was why she trained them the way she did, not to punish, not to prove, but to prepare. Because she knew what it looked like when preparation wasn't enough. When bravery met chaos, and only one walked away. Her hand reached out, brushing over the trident. The metal was cold against her skin. She thought of Vaughn, of his anger, his arrogance, his eventual change. She saw flashes of the cadets helping each other over the wall, crawling in rhythm, moving like one organism instead of many egos. She thought of Harper's words, "Get them home," and realized she finally was. Maybe not those men, but these ones. These kids with too much pride and not enough perspective. She leaned forward, elbows on the desk, whispering to the silence. "Still keeping my promise." The words left her lips like a prayer, carried away by the hum of the air vent, the soft tapping of rain against the glass. Morning came slowly, pale and golden. Rachel stood outside again, the lockbox closed and packed away. The air was crisp, the sky washed clean. From across the field she saw the cadets gathering. They moved differently now. The usual swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, deliberate readiness. Colonel Hayes joined her, hands in his pockets. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," he said softly. "I didn't," she replied. He studied her for a moment. You think they're ready? She watched Vaughn lead the formation, his commands short, precise, confident without arrogance. They're getting there, she said. The colonel nodded. You know, he said, Harper used to say the same thing about you. Rachel turned sharply. You knew Harper? I did, Hayes said. We served together once. He told me about a stubborn lieutenant who refused to leave anyone behind. She looked back toward the field, eyes softening. He taught me what leadership costs, she said quietly, and what it's worth. Hayes smiled faintly. He'd be proud. Rachel didn't answer. She just stood there, watching the cadets as they moved through their morning drills, their voices sharp and unified. The sound of it, the rhythm, the effort, the discipline, it was more than noise. It was a heartbeat. And somewhere deep inside, she knew Harper would have recognized it. That night, Rachel wrote a message on a small piece of paper and tucked it into the lockbox beside the photograph. Just one line. Promise kept. Then she closed the lid, locked it, and placed it back on the shelf. For a long time she stood there, hand resting on the metal. The hum of the bass faded into a quiet hum of peace. Outside, the wind had shifted. The air smelled like salt and new rain. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, tired, scarred, but whole. And for the first time in years, she didn't see the woman who crawled through the mud. She saw the one who got back up. Sometimes, she thought, dignity doesn't speak. It just endures. And sometimes that's enough. Why were the reports suddenly piling up on her desk? It wasn't unusual for instructors to file evaluations, but this was different. Stacks of paperwork, messages from command, and memos stamped with review required. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres leaned back in her chair, reading the same paragraph for the 5th time, not because it was complicated, but because she couldn't believe the tone. Concerns have been raised regarding deviation from standard conditioning protocols. Cadet groups under your supervision have displayed unorthodox field patterns. Recommend assessment of instructor conduct and philosophy for compliance. She exhaled softly. It was happening again. Every system, every institution, it eventually questioned what it didn't understand. A soft knock came at the door. Enter. The door opened. Cadet Vaughn stepped in, standing a little straighter than usual. His uniform was clean, boots polished, posture confident but not prideful. Permission to speak, ma'am. Rachel gestured toward the chair opposite her. Go ahead. He sat, then hesitated, fingers fidgeting on his knees. I wanted to say thank you for last week. Rachel studied him quietly. For what exactly? For not giving up on me, he said, and for not letting me quit on them. There was no bravado in his voice now, no defensiveness, just truth. She gave a small nod. You earned that lesson, she said. You didn't need me to hand it to you. He smiled faintly. Still, I figured you should know. The guys, they talk about you different now. Different how? Like, he shrugged, like you're not just training us, you're rebuilding us. Rachel leaned back, silent. The words struck deeper than he probably realized. After a moment, she said softly, the world outside this base doesn't care how perfect your form looks, Vaughn. It cares how steady you stay when everything falls apart. He nodded, thoughtful. I'll remember that, ma'am. She smiled faintly. Make sure you do. The field forgets faster than it forgives. He stood, saluted, then hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I don't think they understand you yet, but we do. And then he was gone. Rachel sat still for a long time after he left. By the end of the week, whispers had started. Not among the cadets, among the staff. Instructors who'd spent years drilling the same doctrines didn't like how Torres' class had suddenly become the benchmark. Her cadets ran further, worked smarter, fought cleaner. They had discipline without fear, unity without ego. that made people uncomfortable. One afternoon, in the faculty conference room, she found herself across from Captain William Rourke, head of training operations. He was built like a mountain, thick neck, barrel chest, a voice that could break glass. "Lieutenant Commander," he began, sliding a thin folder across the table. "Care to explain this?" Rachel opened it. Inside were performance graphs, impressive ones. Her cadets' numbers outpaced every other group, endurance up, recovery time down, dropout rate 0. "I don't see a problem," she said. "That's the problem," Rourke replied. "Numbers like these don't come from regulation methods." She met his stare evenly. "Maybe regulation methods aren't working as well as we think." The room went still. He leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face, not friendly, just amused. "You think you've reinvented boot camp, Commander?" "No," she said quietly. "I think I remembered what it's supposed to be." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I've read the reports. You let them talk back. You don't punish failure hard enough. You quote philosophy during field runs." Rachel didn't flinch. "I teach them to think, to feel, to trust each other when things go wrong. Because out there, sir, things always go wrong." Rourke's smile faded. "Softness gets people killed," he said flatly. Rachel's voice stayed calm. "So does arrogance." For a long time, the only sound was the hum of the ceiling fan. Finally, Rourke closed the folder and leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I respect your service, Commander," he said, his tone shifting just enough to sound official. "But this program runs on structure, not sentiment. Keep it by the book. No exceptions." Rachel rose slowly. "With respect, sir," she said, "books don't bleed, people do." Then she turned and walked out. Rourke watched her go, expression unreadable. That night, Rachel walked the empty field. The moon was half full, hanging low over the horizon. The damp grass shimmered under its light. She could still hear the cadets' laughter echoing faintly from the barracks, a sound she hadn't expected to miss. Her boots sank softly into the soil. How many times had she stood on fields like this? Different continents, same silence, same questions. She stopped near the obstacle trench, the one that had humbled them all. She crouched down, ran her hand through the packed dirt. The scent of mud and rain pulled her back. Harper's voice, that laughter, that last order. "You get them home." She'd done that again and again. But maybe, she thought, getting them home didn't always mean a rescue helicopter. Maybe it meant teaching them how not to lose themselves in the first place. She looked up at the stars, whispering, "I'm still following your orders, Chief." The wind carried her words away. The next morning, a formal summons awaited her. Command wanted a review of her methods, evaluation of leadership conduct, they called it. Colonel Hayes found her outside the office, already reading the notice. "You're not surprised," he said. "No," Rachel replied, "just disappointed." He gave a quiet chuckle. "That's how I felt the first 10 times I got one." She smiled faintly. "So what happens now?" "You go in, you tell them the truth. They'll test your patience, maybe your pride. Don't give them either." Rachel folded the paper neatly and slid it into her pocket. "Truth's all I've got left, sir." The review room was sterile. White walls, metal table, 3 officers sitting across from her, Rourke among them. "Lieutenant Commander Torres," one began, "your training methods have produced exceptional results, but deviation from standard procedure requires justification. Please explain." Rachel took a slow breath. "I teach human beings, not machines," she said. "I teach them to think under pressure, not just obey." Rourke leaned forward. "Your methods risk undermining the chain of command." Rachel met his gaze. "No, sir, they strengthen it, because a soldier who understands why they follow is more reliable than one who follows blindly." Another officer frowned. "You replace disciplinary isolation with reflection logs. You conducted drills without verbal commands. Why? Rachel's answer was soft but firm. Because silence teaches clarity, and isolation breeds resentment, not discipline. The room fell quiet again. Rourke's jaw tightened. You're turning this into therapy, Commander. No, Rachel said, leaning forward. I'm turning it back into humanity. Her words landed like quiet thunder. The oldest officer, a gray-haired admiral at the end of the table, spoke for the first time. His tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. Why risk your career for this approach? Rachel looked down at her hands, scarred, steady. Because once, she said softly, I watched a man die carrying others out of a firefight. He didn't die for orders. He died for people he believed in. I trained my cadets to become that kind of soldier, the one who remembers what's worth protecting. No one spoke after that. When she left the room, her steps echoed against the hallway walls. Each one sounded like a verdict she hadn't yet heard. Days passed. Whispers spread again, this time from the officers, not the cadets. Some said she'd gone too far. Others called her revolutionary. But the only opinion Rachel cared about came from the faces she saw every morning on the field. They stood straighter now, worked harder, talked less, listened more. And when the next storm rolled in, they didn't scatter for shelter. They stayed outside, training through the rain, mud streaking their faces, determination burning in their eyes. When she asked why, Vaughn had smiled and said, "Because you taught us that the mud's just another kind of lesson, ma'am." She laughed softly. "Looks like you were listening after all." He'd nodded, always. That night, an envelope arrived on her desk. Official letterhead. Command seal. She opened it slowly. Instructor tours, your methods, while unconventional, have demonstrated measurable success in cadet performance, teamwork, and morale. Continue current training with discretion. Additional oversight to follow. Rachel smiled faintly. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't punishment either. It was something better. Freedom. Later, standing alone on the field again, she whispered to the darkness, "You were right, Chief. You don't lead by yelling, you lead by carrying." The wind moved through the trees. The stars burned quietly overhead. She tilted her head back and closed her eyes. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, it felt like it was hers. And she'd keep fighting it, not for recognition, not for redemption, but for something far simpler. To prove that even in a world built on command, compassion still had a place to stand. Why did the alarm sound like that? It wasn't the standard drill siren. This one pulsed lower, slower, heavier. The kind of sound that made every heartbeat sync with it. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres was halfway through reviewing cadet performance reports when the intercom crackled to life. Medical emergency, obstacle field. Repeat, medical emergency, obstacle field. She was already on her feet before the sentence ended. The papers slid from her desk. The door slammed behind her. Rain hammered the ground outside, turning the training field into a mirror of slick earth and gray water. By the time she reached the course, a small crowd had gathered. Cadets, instructors, a medic team just arriving. She pushed through them. What happened? One of the junior instructors swallowed hard. Rope bridge collapse, ma'am. 2 cadets on the line. One's out cold, fell 10 feet onto the retaining trench. Rachel's gaze snapped toward the far side of the field. The wooden bridge sagged under the weight of torn cable, one end half submerged in mud. Without hesitation, she jumped the barrier and ran. The mud grabbed at her boots, cold and unyielding, but she moved through it like it wasn't there. The first cadet, Nolan Briggs, was sitting up, bleeding from the brow, dazed but conscious. The second, Mills, lay motionless, half submerged, his breathing shallow. Rachel dropped to her knees. "Talk to me," she said to the medic kneeling nearby. "Possible spinal, ma'am. He's breathing but unresponsive." Rachel nodded, assessing. Stabilize his neck, get that brace. Vaughn. She turned, realizing Vaughn was already there, soaked, mud-covered, eyes wide but focused. Ma'am. Hold his shoulders steady while they brace. Slow, even pressure. He did exactly as told, no hesitation. No pride, just control. As the medics worked, Rachel stayed crouched beside Mills, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. "You're all right, son," she murmured. "Stay with me, you're safe now." The boy's eyelids fluttered once. Then faintly, "Ma'am, did we fail?" Rachel's throat tightened. She glanced toward the torn rope bridge, the splintered wood, the dangling line, and shook her head. "No," she said softly. "You didn't fail, you held on, that's what matters." 10 minutes later, the medevac chopper thundered in. Wind and rain whipped across the field as the stretcher was loaded. Rachel stood back, eyes following the rising aircraft until it vanished into the clouds. Only when the sound faded did she realize her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from memory. Helm, dust, smoke, Harper's voice. She clenched her fists once, steadying herself. "Commander." Colonel Hayes approached, rain streaking down his jacket. "They'll take him to St. Matthew's. He'll be fine." Rachel nodded, jaw tight. Rourke appeared a few paces behind him, his face unreadable. "Your course," he said bluntly, "just put a cadet in the hospital." Rachel met his eyes, "And my team just saved his life." He didn't answer. Hayes stepped between them, tone firm but even. "This isn't the time, Captain." Rourke's glare lingered for a moment longer, then he turned and walked off. Rachel stood still, rain dripping from the brim of her cap. The rest of the cadets waited behind the barrier, silent, soaked, eyes wide. She finally turned to them. "Training over for today," she said. "Get inside, clean up. I'll brief you later." They hesitated, not wanting to leave her alone. "Go," she repeated, softer this time. Reluctantly, they obeyed. When the last bootstep faded, she looked down at the mud where Mills had fallen. The water pooled slowly, rippling with each raindrop. She crouched and pressed her hand to it, a quiet ritual, almost prayer-like. "You got him home," she whispered. "That's all that counts." By evening, the storm had passed. Rachel sat outside the infirmary, elbows on her knees, staring at the sterile hallway tiles. The hum of the ventilation system filled the silence. The door swung open. A nurse stepped out. "He's stable," she said. "Minor concussion, no spinal damage. He'll make a full recovery." Rachel exhaled, not relief exactly, but release. "Thank you." The nurse smiled faintly and walked off. A moment later, Colonel Hayes appeared, carrying 2 coffee cups. He handed her one and took the seat beside her. "You handled that well," he said. "I handled it like I've handled everything," she replied quietly. "One breath at a time." He nodded. "Rourke's calling for an immediate audit." "Of course he is. He thinks your methods created an unsafe environment." Rachel laughed once, not bitter, just tired. "He's right about one thing. It's not safe, but neither is the world we send them into." Hayes looked at her. "You ready for another fight?" She sipped the coffee, the warmth grounding her. "Always." The next morning, the review board assembled again, faster than anyone expected. Rachel entered the same sterile room, the same 3 officers waiting. Rourke at the center this time. "Commander Torres," the senior officer began. "Yesterday's incident raises questions about oversight. Do you take responsibility?" "Yes," Rachel said. "For the accident, for the response, and for the outcome." Rourke folded his arms. "You call that an outcome?" "Yes," she said, voice steady, "because no one died." He leaned forward. "Your cadets reacted outside of protocol. No authorization, no chain of command confirmation. They moved on instinct." Rachel met his stare. "Exactly, and that instinct saved a life." A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "Commander," another officer interjected, "you're teaching independence in a system built on obedience." "I'm teaching accountability," she countered. "If obedience costs seconds in a crisis, people die. I won't train soldiers to freeze while they wait for permission." The room went quiet. Rourke's jaw flexed, his eyes hard. "You think your way's better than ours?" "No," she said softly, "I think it's human." The senior officer leaned back, studying her. "You believe emotion belongs in combat." Rachel's gaze didn't waver. "I believe empathy keeps us from becoming the things we fight." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then quietly, the admiral at the end of the table said, "I read the medevac report. Your cadet's quick stabilization was textbook. That came from you." Rachel didn't answer. He turned to the others. "Sometimes doctrine learns slower than people do." Rourke shifted in his seat, frustration barely masked. The admiral nodded once. "Commander Torres, the board finds your response appropriate under the circumstances. Your methods remain unconventional but effective. Dismissed." Rachel stood, saluted, and walked out without a word. Outside, the sun had broken through the storm clouds. The air smelled clean again, that faint mix of mud, sea salt, and jet fuel that every base seemed to share. The cadets waited near the field. Vaughn was there, Mills too, bandaged but smiling. When Rachel approached, the group snapped to attention. "At ease," she said. Mills stepped forward, wincing slightly but grinning. "They said I'll be back in training next week, ma'am." "Good," she replied, "because next week's worse." The laughter that followed was real, tired, honest, unforced. Vaughn looked at her, expression steady. "Ma'am," he said, "when the bridge went down, we didn't wait, we just moved. It felt like you were still there, telling us what to do." Rachel nodded slowly. "You didn't need me, that's the point." He frowned slightly. "I thought the point was to follow orders." She smiled faintly. "Only until you learn which ones to give." The group fell silent, the weight of that lesson settling in. Rachel looked out over the field, the bridge already under repair, the mud drying in streaks under the sun. "Every scar this place leaves," she said quietly, "is a reminder, not a failure, of survival." Mills nodded, his grin softening. "You really believe that?" "I have to," she said. "It's what keeps the ghosts quiet." Vaughn exchanged a glance with the others, a silent acknowledgement that they understood more than her words. She gave a small nod toward the horizon. "Run your cooldown laps, slow pace, reflect on what happened, not the fall, the response." They saluted, turned, and began jogging in formation. Rachel watched them go, their boots hitting the earth in unison, their shadows stretching long behind them. Hayes walked up beside her, hands clasped behind his back. "You realize you just turned a near disaster into a masterclass," he said. "Luck," she replied. He chuckled. "You don't believe in luck." "No," she admitted. "I believe in preparation disguised as instinct." They stood there for a while, watching the cadets circle the field. "Rourke won't stop pushing," Hayes warned. "I don't need him to stop," Rachel said. "I just need him to watch." Hayes smiled. "You think he'll learn?" She looked toward the rising sun, its light reflecting off the wet ground. "Everyone learns," she said softly. "Some just need more mud." That night, as the base lights flickered off one by one, Rachel walked the field again. The bridge had been repaired, the mud had hardened, the air was still. She stopped halfway across the course and knelt, pressing her palm against the ground, the same gesture she'd made that morning. Her whisper was almost inaudible. "Still getting them home." Above her, the sky stretched wide and endless, the stars flickering like the ghosts of every lesson she'd ever learned. She stood slowly, squared her shoulders, and walked back toward the barracks, the silhouette of a woman who had carried storms and learned to make peace with the thunder. Why was the parade ground so full before sunrise? The air was cold, sharp with the smell of dew and jet fuel. A light fog clung to the field, wrapping the line of cadets like a thin veil of memory. The base was silent except for boots scuffing against the pavement and the occasional creak of the flagpole in the wind. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres walked toward the platform at the far end of the formation, unsure why she'd even been summoned this early. She wasn't on the roster. No briefing was scheduled. Colonel Hayes waited at the platform steps, hands clasped behind his back. "Morning, Commander," he said quietly. "Morning, sir. Glad you're here. Sir, may I ask what this is?" He just smiled faintly. "You'll see." The crowd parted as she walked up the few metal steps. From this height, she could see the entire base. Hundreds of cadets lined up in formation, instructors at the periphery, the rising sun just beginning to turn the fog to gold. The intercom clicked once, then hissed softly. "Attention to orders," Hayes said, his voice carrying over the field. "Today, we recognize a leader whose example has redefined what strength and service mean within these walls." Rachel frowned slightly, glancing at him. He continued, "For exceptional leadership, integrity, and service in advancing human-centered training methods under Naval Special Warfare Doctrine, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres is hereby commended with the Distinguished Service Cross." The words hit her like a slow-moving wave. The crowd erupted, not the ceremonial clapping of an order being followed, but something raw, human, real. Rachel stood frozen, eyes wide, jaw tight. Hayes stepped closer, holding out the small velvet box. "You earned this," he said softly. Her throat constricted. "I didn't ask for it." He smiled faintly. "That's why you're getting it." She hesitated before taking it, the metal heavier than it looked. For a moment the sunlight glinted off the polished surface, and she saw her own reflection, tired, scarred, but at peace. She looked out across the field, the cadets standing tall, faces young but eyes older. Vaughn stood at the front of his unit, shoulders squared, Mills beside him with a faint grin. They looked different now. She could see it in how they stood. The stillness wasn't stiffness anymore, it was composure. She raised the microphone slowly. Her hand shook just once before steadying. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice low but clear, "because honestly this isn't mine." The murmurs faded instantly. "I came here to teach. You came here to learn. But somewhere between the mud and the rain, we all ended up learning the same thing, that strength doesn't come from shouting or from being unbreakable. It comes from breaking and standing back up anyway." Her gaze found Vaughn in the front row. He held her eyes proud, still humbled. "When I first arrived," she said softly, "you all looked at me and saw someone you didn't understand. Maybe you thought I didn't belong. Maybe I thought that too." A faint ripple of laughter broke the tension, light, genuine. "But what none of us saw," she continued, "was that belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you build. One lesson, one bruise, one scar at a time." She paused, breathing in slowly. The wind shifted, brushing against her face like the faintest memory of desert heat and sand. "I didn't tell you everything about my past," she said, "but I will now." The field went silent again. "I lost my team once, good men, better friends. One of them, Chief Warrant Officer Dean Harper, gave his life dragging our wounded out of an ambush. Before he died, he told me, 'You get them home.' That wasn't an order, it was a promise." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. "I've spent every day since then trying to keep it. And when I came here, I realized, home doesn't always mean a battlefield. Sometimes it's right here, making sure the next generation walks out of this place ready not just to fight, but to live." A quiet stillness blanketed the field. Hayes looked down, eyes misted, pretending not to wipe them. Rachel's tone softened. "This medal might have my name on it, but it belongs to every one of you who learned to lift each other instead of tearing each other down. To every cadet who fell and got back up. To every instructor who dared to believe there's a better way to lead. Her eyes lifted to the flag above, now catching the first full light of dawn. Because leadership, she said, isn't about being followed. It's about being remembered when you're gone. The wind caught her words, scattering them across the field like ash in sunlight. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward and removed the medal from its case. She held it out to Vaughn. He froze, "Ma'am." She smiled softly. "Take it, it's not for me." "I can't." "Yes, you can," she said gently. "You represent what this stands for. You changed." He swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "Because you made us." Rachel shook her head. "No, cadet, because you listened." Vaughn stepped forward, took the medal carefully, and saluted. She returned it, crisp, precise, steady. The applause that followed rolled across the base like thunder. For once, Rachel didn't shy away from it. She stood there, letting the sound wash over her, not as validation, but as closure. Later that morning, after the ceremony, she walked the empty field one last time. The grass was damp with dew. The repaired rope bridge gleamed faintly under the sunlight. She stopped near the trench, crouched, and pressed her hand into the earth again. That old habit, half memory, half ritual. "You'd like them, Harper," she whispered. "You really would." The wind moved gently through the trees. She looked up, eyes following the sunlight breaking through the clouds. The air smelled of salt and soil and life, everything she used to think she'd lost. By afternoon, the cadets were dismissed for weekend leave. Most of them ran for the buses, shouting, laughing, kids again, for a little while. But Vaughn stayed behind. He found Rachel near the training course, arms crossed, watching the ocean in the distance. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" he asked. "Always." He hesitated. "I don't think I've ever said this out loud, but you changed the way I see things, not just training, everything." Rachel turned slightly. "How so?" He looked out toward the horizon. "Before this, I thought leadership was about being loud enough that people listened. Now I know it's about being steady enough that they trust you." She smiled faintly. "You'll make a good officer." He laughed softly. "Maybe, still got a lot to learn." "So do we all," she said. He hesitated. "You ever regret coming here?" She thought about it for a long moment, then shook her head. "No, I needed to remember who I was, not the uniform, not the medals, just me." He nodded, understanding more than he said. She extended her hand. He took it, firm, respectful. "Take care of them," she said quietly. "I will." He turned and walked away, his silhouette blending into the mist rising off the field. Rachel watched until he disappeared. Then she turned back toward the sea. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of the past pressing on her. She felt it walking beside her, not a burden, but a companion. The kind that stays quiet but never leaves. That night, she packed the small metal lockbox into her duffel. She didn't open it this time. She didn't need to. The trident inside had done its job. The photograph had kept its promise. The note, "Promise kept," said everything that still needed saying. She zipped the bag closed, turned off the light, and stood by the window. Outside, the moonlight cut across the field like a silver trail, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. She whispered softly, more to herself than to anyone else, "Some promises don't end. They just change shape." Her reflection stared back, older, quieter, steadier. A woman who had been pushed down, mocked, doubted. And who rose, not to prove them wrong, but to prove herself right. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from peace, not pride. Then she whispered one last line, the truth she'd learned, earned, and lived. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The wind outside shifted, carrying her words into the night. And for the first time in years, Rachel Torres let herself sleep, not as a soldier, not as an instructor, but as someone who had finally made it home.